A crystal champagne flute didn't just fall. It shattered against the imported Italian marble, with a clean, sharp chime. It seemed to instantly vacuum the air out of the grand ballroom. A single drop of Moet stained the hem of my $11 thrift store skirt. Seat 74, Evelyn. Row double letter K, right behind the industrial ice machine, where the catering staff vents the kitchen heat. My ex-husband, Richard, said. His voice carried that smooth, practiced baritone he used to charm zoning boards and venture capitalists. He flipped the cheap printed paper ticket, with his manicured thumb letting it flutter through the air. It drifted past his polished Tom Ford Oxfords and landed square against the scuffed toe of my black leather duty boot. That is the precise level of your contribution to this evening. Sit there. Stay out of the photography lights and do not tell anyone. You used to share my last name. The donors are here to see pedigree, not government surplus. Richard stood 3 feet away. He was draped in a custom midnight blue tuxedo that my silent financial sacrifices had paid for. During our 12 years of marriage, clustered tightly around him were his new family, the pillars of Arlington's high society. His new wife, Julianne, a woman 20 years younger, whose skin looked as polished and sterile as a private clinic wall, curled her lip in quiet, open contempt. She clutched a shimmering stack of VIP gold leaf passes to her chest like armor. "Look at you, Evelyn," Julianne whispered. She pitched it perfectly, so the wealthy couple standing at the nearby registration desk would hear every syllable. "This gala is raising funds for the preservation of historical heritage. True legacy. It isn't an internal civilian office, where a glorified log clerk can slide by on a stagnant federal salary. You smell like stale coffee and old filing cabinets. You wouldn't even know which crystal glass belongs to the white wine. You're better off sitting where the help breathes." Richard's new brother-in-law, a hedge fund manager named Pierce, whose entire portfolio had been saved from a regulatory seizure by an anonymous federal intervention 3 years ago, snickered into his scotch. The entire reception line went dead silent. The heavy, gold-trimmed curtains of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom seemed to stiffen. The ambient noise of ice clinking against silver ice buckets evaporated. For 22 years, I had quietly authorized the secure network infrastructure that protected Pierce's private server banks from foreign state-sponsored intrusions. For 22 years, I had routed my combat hazard pay, my classified operational bonuses, and my specialized defense allowances through a double-blind institutional trust. I did this to keep Richard's family estate from slipping into foreclosure, while he built his public myth as a self-made real estate tycoon. They never knew the trust existed. They thought it was a benevolent endowment from a deceased distant uncle who admired Richard's vision. Tonight, the quiet woman who tolerated their smallness died. I didn't bend down to retrieve the paper trash at my feet. Instead, I pulled a matte black, red-bordered biometric credential card from the inner pocket of my faded blazer. I didn't engage with Richard. I didn't look at Julianne. I walked directly past them, my boots striking the marble with a steady, unhurried cadence. I approached the 3 federal security officers standing near the perimeter doors, men wearing earpieces, and the discreet silver lapel pins of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cyber Division. The lead special agent's eyes went from relaxed vigilance to absolute stillness. It took the fraction of a second. His gaze dropped to the red holographic stripe on my card. His jaw tightened. He didn't ask for a secondary document. He pressed his left earpiece with 2 fingers, signaled his team, and stepped back 3 full paces. The heavy oak doors didn't just swing open. They were held by 2 tactical operators, who moved with the synchronized fluid speed of men trained to clear rooms in dark valleys. The air in the ballroom grew instantly cold, as the building's secondary air filtration system hummed to life. 6 fully armed federal cyber response tactical operators, clad in pristine black gear, with submachine guns tucked tightly against their chests, marched through the threshold in a flawless security wedge. A senior director, A man whose face was etched with the gray lines of 30 years of federal service, snapped his heels together on the marble floor. The sound cracked through the ballroom, like a pistol shot. He threw a razor-sharp, unwavering salute. "Colonel Melendez," Director Thomas Sterling announced. His gravelly voice projected into every corner of the high-ceilinged room. "The command vehicle is secure on the tarmac, ma'am. The foreign node has just breached the local financial server, located within this very facility. We are locked down on your mark. Your terminal is live. But before I tell you why these high-ranking federal officials, men who command the absolute cutting edge of national security, were standing at rigid attention before an $11 thrift store blazer, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Because what happened next at that dinner line, no one in that room saw coming, and the silent hell I endured to keep their fake empire afloat was about to breach the surface. My name is Evelyn Melendez. I am 54 years old. If you looked at me on an ordinary Tuesday morning, at the grocery store in Arlington, Virginia, you would see a woman who has given up on the visual performance of wealth. I wear loose-fitting, $5 cotton shirts from the local department store. My hair is a silver gray that I refuse to dye, tied back in a functional knot that takes less than 10 seconds to secure. I drive a dented, 12-year-old dark blue Ford Escape, with a rusted rear quarter panel, and an engine that idles with a low, wet rumble. I let them believe it. I never corrected their assumptions. When the neighbors looked over the fence at my small, 2-bedroom brick bungalow, the one with the peeling paint on the front porch, and the small fern sitting in the window, and assumed I was a retired civilian clerk scraping by on a low-tier government pension, I simply nodded and asked about their lawns. When Richard's cousins saw me at a diner ordering the cheapest black coffee on the menu and leaving a $3 tip in crisp folded ones, I let them believe that every dollar was a struggle. Modesty is not a consequence of lack. For me, it was a deliberate choice. After you have spent 2 decades inside the windowless, concrete sublevels of the Pentagon and the high-altitude bunkers of Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado Springs, the constant public performance of status becomes incredibly exhausting. When your daily responsibility involves managing the invisible electronic lines that prevent a foreign adversary from turning off the hospital ventilators and traffic grids of the entire eastern seaboard, you lose the capacity to care about the brand of a man's watch. The only real indicator of my past is a deep, heavy ache in my lower lumbar spine. It is the permanent compression of 3 discs from a hard parachute landing during a night insertion behind the lines near Herat in 2011. It flares up whenever the humidity changes, or when I am forced to sit in a cramped space for more than an hour. I don't talk about it. I don't lean against walls to relieve the pressure. I simply stand up straight, lock my core, and carry the weight exactly how the Air Force taught me to carry it. Beneath my faded blazer, hanging against my skin by a standard-issue steel ball chain, are 2 heavy silver dog tags. They don't bear a standard civilian designation. They are stamped with a restricted department serial number and a single 5-letter word that 99% of the active-duty military will never see in an open ledger: Ghost. That call sign wasn't given to me because I was invisible. It was given to me because, by the time the enemy realizes I am inside their network, their systems have already ceased to belong to them. For 19 years, I lived in that digital ether, commanding a Tier 1 national security cyber defense operation that protected billions of dollars in infrastructure, while remaining completely dead to the public world. My family, the people who shared my blood and my former name, knew absolutely nothing about the eagles on my shoulders. They chose not to know, because if they acknowledged who I really was, they would have to acknowledge that the woman they used as their emotional footstool was the only reason they had a floor to stand on. The pattern of their contempt didn't begin at the Ritz-Carlton gala. It was a slow, deliberate accumulation of small exclusions, some that built a wall over 20 years. At exactly 6 o'clock on Thanksgiving evening in 2024, I pulled my dented Ford Escape into the sweeping, circular driveway of the Melendez estate in Northern Virginia. The house was a massive $6 million colonial manor, with white columns that shone under expensive landscape lighting. I had just completed a grueling 36-hour shift at the Pentagon's restricted Cyber Command sublevel. I was tracking an advanced persistent threat group that was trying to inject a dormant payload into the regional switching stations of the Atlantic power grid. My eyes were bloodshot, and my fingers still carried the stiff cramp of typing thousands of lines of defensive code under a red countdown timer. The moment my boot touched the manicured gravel, the heavy mahogany front door swung open. Richard stood on the porch, a crystal tumbler of 16-year-old Lagavulin resting in his palm. His face didn't soften with recognition. His eyes didn't look to see if I was carrying a bag, or if my face was drawn with fatigue. "Evelyn, for God's sake," he said. His voice dropped into that familiar tone of annoyed middle-class embarrassment. "Did you have to park that eyesore right next to the catering van? Pierce's investors from New York are arriving in 5 minutes. And your rusted bumper looks like a welfare claim. Move it behind the tractor shed near the service gate. And use the side entrance through the mudroom. You're tracking grease." I didn't argue. I didn't tell him that the eyesore had an encrypted satellite uplink terminal hidden beneath the spare tire well that cost more than his entire garage of German sports cars. I backed the truck into the dark mud behind the garden shed, where the dead leaves from the oak trees were left to rot. Inside the dining hall, the air was heavy with the rich, oily scent of roasted goose and truffles. 14 people sat around a 14-foot table, made of reclaimed teak. Pierce's venture capital partners, their immaculate wives, and Richard's mother, Eleanor, a woman who had spent 40 years maintaining the fiction that her family was descended from Virginia royalty. I was given a seat at the far end, near the swing door that led to the kitchen. There was no linen napkin for me, no silver-rimmed water goblet. Instead, my place was marked by a chipped, white ceramic plate that Richard had bought during his college years, a piece of utility stoneware that didn't match the gold-leaf porcelain set everyone else used. "We have to be practical," Eleanor chirped from the head of the table. Her diamond rings caught the chandelier light as she spooned a massive portion of dark meat onto Pierce's plate. "Our CEO needs his strength, the man who single-handedly resurrected the Melendez development brand from the ashes of the 2018 credit crunch. A true financial prodigy. From the ashes," Pierce repeated. He nodded with a solemn, self-satisfied smile, while his wife patted his arm. They truly believed that myth. They had entirely forgotten, or chosen to erase, the fact that in October of 2018, their payroll accounts were completely dry. Their main commercial project was locked in a mechanics lien, and Pierce was 12 hours away from a federal fraud indictment for commingling investor funds. They didn't know that an anonymous shell corporation registered in Wilmington, Delaware, funded entirely by a highly classified defense intelligence award I had received for neutralizing a foreign banking hack, had quietly wired $450,000 into their corporate checking account. At 3 a.m, Pierce had gone on to give interviews to the local business journal about the mysterious angel investor who recognized his innate leadership instincts. The angel investor was currently sitting next to the kitchen door, eating a dry, stringy piece of turkey wing that Eleanor had hacked off the bone with aggressive efficiency. "You should watch your portions, Evelyn," Eleanor said loudly. She ensured her words carried over the low murmur of the investor's conversation. A sedentary government job behind a desk makes a woman thick. It's no wonder Richard had to seek out someone who actually understands how to present herself in public. A man of his stature can't be anchored to a clerk who looks like she works at the motor vehicle department. Julianne smirked, leaning over to whisper something to her niece. The investors looked down at their plates, nodding with that polite, silent complicity that wealth demands from strangers. After dinner, Richard triumphantly presented Eleanor with the keys to a brand-new, metallic silver Mercedes station wagon. The old woman wept with theatrical pride, clutching Richard's face as if he had pulled her from a burning building. One of the New York investors, a younger man named Henderson, who hadn't yet learned to completely ignore the person at the end of the table, leaned toward me. "And what branch of the service did you say you were in, Evelyn?" I noticed the boots. Before my lips could form a single syllable, Richard cut in from across the teak table. Evelyn does back-office data entry for the administrative pool. Basic scheduling, archiving old files. We don't really bring the bureaucracy home with us, Henderson. Let's talk about that new commercial zone in Reston. The investor nodded politely. His eyes instantly lost interest, and he turned his shoulder toward me for the remainder of the evening. As I prepared to leave at midnight, Eleanor walked into the mudroom, where I was putting on my coat. She reached into the pocket of her silk apron and pulled out a small, crumpled bundle of green paper, sliding it into my bare hand. "I found these behind the pantry shelf," she whispered. Her voice carried no malice, only that flat, crushing certainty of my inferiority. Old Koskish coupons for bulk canned tuna and crackers. They expired 10 days ago. But if you create a bit of a fuss at the discount supermarket in town, the manager will usually give you the clearance rate out of pity. A single woman on a civil service grade shouldn't be proud. Take them. I looked down at the frayed, grease-stained paper in my palm. Julianne was standing in the doorway, watching with her arms crossed, a soft, musical laugh escaping her throat. Her 12-year-old son, Leo, leaned past her hip and whispered, "Dad says Aunt Evelyn is the reason we don't invite the neighbors to Thanksgiving. He says she's the family budget leak." Nobody corrected the child. Richard stood behind them, adjusting his gold cufflinks, his eyes completely blank as he looked through me. The silence in that mudroom was heavier and colder than any low-frequency electronic jamming signal I had ever encountered in the field. My knuckles turned white against the lining of my coat pocket. Under the fabric, my fingers touched the screen of my secure, encrypted cellular device. I opened the institutional banking portal. There it was. An automatic, recurring monthly transfer of $12,500. Scheduled for the upcoming first of the month. A payment from my blind trust that directly serviced the massive bridge loan, keeping Richard's entire Reston project from being foreclosed on by the regional bank. My thumb hovered over the red Terminate Authorization button. 20 years of combat hazard pay, 19 years of sleeping on cot frames inside concrete bunkers, and every single dollar earned while dodging the silent, invisible bullets of foreign cyber warfare, all routed to keep these people in silk aprons and German cars. Every letter I had sent home from my deployments in the sandbox had been found 3 years later in a cardboard box behind Eleanor's garage. The wax stamps were unbroken, the envelopes sliced open only at the corner, where the $100 emergency cash bills had been tucked inside. They had recycled my love like junk mail, but they had never missed a single check. Eleanor clinked her champagne glass against the doorframe, announcing the family's upcoming winter trip to the historic Heritage Gala in Arlington. "First-class cabins for the executive team, of course," she said. "And Evelyn, you'll drive the luggage trunks up from the storage unit in the old truck. We can't have the leather handles scratching against Pierce's golf travel bags. You'll stay at the motel near the highway exit. It's only 20 minutes from the Ritz, and they have free parking for commercial vehicles." My thumb slowly pulled away from the screen. Not yet. A tactical operator never strikes when the target is expecting a reaction. The termination would happen on a timeline that ensured absolute, unmitigated impact. The crisis didn't wait for the gala, but it chose that exact week to mature. At exactly 3 a.m. on December 14th, the emergency red line terminal beneath my bed in the bungalow didn't ring. It vibrated with a specific, low-frequency pulse that indicated a Category 1 national security breach. A steady, cold rain was drumming against my bedroom window, streaking the glass with silver lines that looked like falling code. The air in the room was cold. I kept the thermostat at 62 degrees to stay sharp. "Ghost is online," I said into the encrypted receiver, my voice instantly shedding the soft, slow cadence of the retired civilian clerk. "We have a Tier 1 intrusion at the Financial Clearance Hub in Northern Virginia." Director Sterling's voice came through. It was stripped of all human emotion by the digital scrambler. A foreign state actor has bypassed the primary perimeter firewalls. They are using a compromised commercial contractor network as a bridgehead. If they clear the secondary validation layer, they will freeze the liquidity assets of every federal defense logistics supplier on the eastern seaboard within 48 hours. We need the original architect. The bridgehead, I muttered. My fingers were already flying across the modified, mechanical keyboard on my desk. Give me the specific IP range. When the data blocks flashed onto my dual high-resolution monitors, a cold iron knot tightened in my stomach. The compromised contractor network wasn't a random defense firm. The digital signature belonged to Melendez Corporate Holdings, the exact commercial real estate firm Richard owned and Pierce managed. They had cut corners on their network security to save $14,000 on a third-party firewall, leaving an open port that a sophisticated hostile intelligence unit had used to tunnel into the federal financial grid. They were currently sleeping in their Egyptian cotton sheets, completely unaware that their laziness had invited a wolf into the nation's basement. Before I could lock my terminal, my civilian burner phone on the corner of the desk lit up with a text message from Julianne. Make sure you pick up the heavy starch shirts for Richard from the dry cleaners before you load the luggage trunks tomorrow. Do not let the driver park your junk car in the main driveway. Use the service lane. We have people from the state senate coming. I looked at the text. Then I looked at the red flashing vector on my tactical screen that showed the foreign malware currently draining the security parameters of the server that sat in the basement of the very hotel where their gala was being held. Training took over. Not anger, not revenge. The cold, mechanical precision of an officer who had survived 3 separate combat deployments behind the veil. I didn't type a reply to Julianne. I didn't scream into the empty room. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Major General Mike Miller's private line at the Pentagon. Major General Mike Iron Miller did not look like a man who spent his time in air-conditioned offices, standing 6'4", with 240 pounds of muscle, and a thick ridge of pale scar tissue running from his left ear down to his collarbone, the souvenir of a close-quarters grenade blast in Fallujah. He was the commanding officer of the entire Air Force Cyber Operations Command. At 7:30 the next morning, I stood at rigid attention, inside his secure, soundproofed office in the E-ring of the Pentagon. The rain outside had turned into a thick, gray sleet that rattled against the reinforced glass like gravel. Miller was flipping through my deployment file. He stopped at a printed page that had been mistakenly included by a junior administrative assistant, the United Airlines economy itinerary that Eleanor had forwarded to my personal email, detailing my flight back to Colorado Springs after the holiday. Seat 42E, Miller read aloud. His deep, gravelly voice dropped into a register that usually preceded a court-martial or an airstrike. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto the silver eagles pinned to my uniform shirt, beneath my civilian coat. Colonel Melendez, explain to me why the Chief Operations Officer of Operation Sentinel Shield, a woman who holds a clearance that requires a 7-year background update, is flying in a middle seat next to the chemical toilets on a commercial puddle jumper, while her former civilian spouse is currently listed as a VIP guest in the governor's box at the Ritz-Carlton Gala. I stared at the white wall behind his head, my posture as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. I let them believe it, sir. It maintained the civilian cover required for my localized asset monitoring. I never corrected their assumptions. You let them believe you were a clerk, Miller growled. He slammed his fist onto his mahogany desk with a force that caused his heavy pewter coffee mug to bounce and spill a dark circle onto his blotter. Neither of us flinched. I watched you walk out of a burning command tent in Kandahar, with shrapnel in your thigh, carrying an encrypted hard drive in one hand and a wounded sergeant in the other, and you are telling me you sat at the end of a table and let an arrogant real estate fraud hand you expired tuna coupons. I remained silent. The clock on his wall ticked with a heavy, metallic click. DNA is a biological accident, Evelyn, Miller said. His voice softened just enough to reveal the deep, protective loyalty that only exists between people who have shared the same dirt. He stood up, walked around the desk, and placed a massive, calloused hand on my shoulder. Respect is what builds a coordinate space. Your former family is looking at a diamond and screaming that it's gravel, because they don't have the eyes to see the light. You have bled to keep this country's lights on, overseas. When are you going to stand up and defend your own baseline? He didn't wait for an answer. He reached for his secure red telephone and dialed the Air Mobility Command Desk at Andrews Air Force Base. "This is General Miller," he barked. "Activate Priority 1 Protection Protocol for Colonel Evelyn Melendez. I want a C-37B, Gulfstream VIP transport fueled and waiting on the tarmac at National Airport by 1800 hours tonight. Assign a 6-man security detail from the Cyber Response Group to intercept her at her local coordinate. She is now an active high-value asset in a live counter-intrusion operation." He hung up the phone and slid a heavy black biometric ID card, with a thick red holographic stripe across the desk toward me. "Stand up straight, Colonel," Miller said, his eyes drilling into mine. "That is a direct order from your commanding officer. Go turn off their lights." The Ritz-Carlton Grand Ballroom was an explosion of gold leaf, white orchids, and the suffocating artificial glare of high-end photography lights. More than 300 people, the entire economic and political elite of the region, milled about under massive crystal chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like frozen fire. They performed their wealth under the brilliant, aggressive illumination, desperate to be seen in the light, while I remained perfectly content in the deliberate shadows of my cover story. Richard stood at the center of the room, surrounded by 3 members of the State Zoning Board, and his primary venture capital partners from New York. He looked like a king in his custom tuxedo, his chest expanded with the pride of a man who believed his own public relations materials. 12 years, gentlemen," Richard boasted loudly. He adjusted his silk lapels as he raised his voice for the surrounding donors to hear. 12 long years of absolute calculated grit to build the Melendez development brand to this summit. And tonight, with this incoming $28 million state commercial contract, we officially enter the state's true financial legacy. It takes an extraordinary mind to anchor a portfolio of this scale. I walked into the perimeter of their circle at exactly 8 o'clock, wearing my worn $11 tweed blazer and my old leather boots. I stood perfectly still, observing the raw, fragile loudness of his performance. The moment Eleanor and Julianne spotted me, their faces tightened with that sharp, class anxiety that defined their entire existence. Julianne stepped forward, her eyes trailing over my scuffed duty boots with deep, public revulsion. "Look at how she just stands there against the pillar," Julianne whispered to Eleanor, tossing her head back with a sharp, mocking sneer. "Completely gray, stiff as a corpse, and fading into the wallpaper. She is quite literally a ghost haunting this family's reputation. Richard, I simply cannot comprehend how you spent a single decade tied to a back-office desk clerk who has absolutely nothing to offer the world but silence." Richard turned, his baritone voice carrying that smooth, condescending edge that had defined our final years together. "Evelyn, let's not make a scene. Take your ticket." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the cheap paper slip, and tossed it toward my face. It hit my cheek and fluttered down to the marble floor, landing right between my boots. "Row double-letter K, Evelyn," Richard said. His voice cut clearly over the low chamber music of the string quartet. "Sit near the kitchen exit. The air conditioning is better back there for civil servants." Julianne laughed, a high, clear sound that drew the attention of the state senator standing 10 feet away. Pierce raised his scotch glass in a silent toast of amusement. That was the exact moment. The universe corrected its coordinate space. From the far corner of the ballroom, near the secure communications entrance, the heavy double oak doors were thrown back with a sudden, violent force that caused the massive crystal chandelier overhead to vibrate with a low, musical hum. The sound of 300 wealthy people talking was instantly cut short, replaced by the heavy, synchronized thud of 12 tactical combat boots striking the stone floor in perfect time. The string quartet stopped mid-measure. The violinist's bow screeched across the string with a sharp, broken note. In that immediate, suffocating vacuum of absolute stillness, Richard's hand shook so violently his 16-year-old Lagavulin slipped from his fingers. The heavy crystal tumbler hit the polished stone floor and shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. The room froze into an unbreakable, dead silence. In that absolute hush, the world zoomed down to an impossibly small, strange frame. All I could hear was the faint, rhythmic, and entirely undisturbed buzz of a lone fly that had just detached from the gold leaf molding and landed squarely on the petal of a white orchid right in front of Richard's pale face. The tiny sound amplified across the motionless room like a ticking clock. Suddenly, the ballroom's primary gold chandeliers flickered out, plunging the elite crowd into an ominous cold shadow. A second later, the building's emergency tactical backup systems engaged, flooding the marble and the white orchids. With the sharp, rotating crimson glow of a federal infrastructure breach alert, 6 Air Force cyber response operators, dressed in full tactical black gear, their helmets gleaming under the blood-red emergency lights, their submachine guns locked across their chests in a defensive stack, sprinted through the scattering crowd. They didn't look at the art on the walls. They didn't look at the politicians. They moved with the terrifying, single-minded precision of a wolf pack clearing a trench line. The crowd scattered, pressing their bodies hard against the velvet-lined walls. The operators converged directly on my position, spinning outward into an impenetrable 360-degree security perimeter. Their weapons were held at a low-ready position, their eyes scanning the room with the cold, unblinking vigilance of men who had spent their lives in live-fire zones. Director Thomas Sterling stepped through the center of the crimson-lit formation, his black leather shoes striking the stone with a clear, sharp report. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at the senator. He stopped exactly 3 paces from me, his boots snapping together with a sound like a rifle shot. He threw a salute so crisp, his white glove caught the red flashing light like a flare. "Colonel Melendez," Director Sterling announced. His voice boomed through the absolute dead silence of the room. "The foreign malware has just executed its final validation sequence through Melendez Corporate Holdings' local server bank. The network is compromised. General Miller has declared a Priority 1 national emergency. The grid is yours, ma'am." Richard's face drained from a healthy cocktail tan to the color of wet ash under the crimson light. Evelyn," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic register that stripped away 30 years of practiced elegance. "No, that's impossible. She's just an administrative clerk. She files expense reports." "Step back 10 feet from the colonel, sir," the lead tactical operator barked. His chest blocked Richard like a stone retaining wall. "But she's my ex-wife," Richard shrieked, his social confidence completely collapsing into a panicked, childlike whine. As his $28 million contract evaporated in the red glare, "Evelyn, tell them who I am. My company is about to sign a multi-million-dollar state contract tonight." I looked at him through the narrow gap between the shoulders of the 2 armed operators. My posture was perfectly straight, my spine locked into the rigid alignment of an officer who had held the line against darkness on 2 continents. "I let you believe it," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The silence in that room amplified every syllable, until it felt like a heavy weight pressing against their chests. "I never corrected your assumptions, Richard. You thought my modesty was your victory." I turned my back on him. "Director Sterling, isolate the Melendez network node, purge the server, terminate their federal clearance permanently." "Understood, Colonel," Sterling replied. Behind the wall of black Kevlar, Eleanor dropped to her knees on the stained marble floor, her expensive silk gown soaking up the spilled scotch and dirty water from my boots. A high, desperate sound that echoed off the high gold ceilings like an animal caught in a trap. The private confrontation in the holding room behind the ballroom took less than 3 minutes. Richard stood against the concrete wall, his bow tie undone, his hair damp with sweat. Julianne was weeping silently into her hands in the corner, her expensive makeup running in dark, ragged lines down her neck. "Evelyn, please," Richard whispered, his eyes wide with the raw, animal terror of a man who had just realized his safety net had not only vanished, but had turned into the blade that was cutting his throat. The bank. They just sent an automated notification. The bridge loan. The trust account has been frozen. My company's stock is in free fall. If that federal clearance is pulled, we lose everything by midnight. We're ruined. I stood 3 feet away from him, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. My worn tweed blazer hung open to reveal the matte black biometric credential card resting against my shirt. "You didn't lose your company because of me, Richard," I said. My voice was as steady and cold as a concrete bunker. "You lost your company because you thought security was an expense. You could cut to buy a newer German car. You thought people who wore worn coats were weak. You forgot that the people who bleed for you are the only reason you have the luxury of being small." "We're family, Evelyn," he sobbed. He reached out a manicured hand that trembled like a dry leaf. 12 years of marriage. You can't just walk away and let us starve." I looked at his fingers for a long moment, remembering the Thanksgiving table, the chipped plate, and the expired tuna coupons thrown into my coat pocket. "DNA doesn't make a coordinate space, Richard," I said softly. "Respect does. You broke this perimeter 20 years ago. Clean up your own debris." Before I could turn, a senior cybersecurity technician under Sterling's command hurried into the holding room. He held an encrypted federal tablet, live linked to the corporate compliance registries. "Colonel Melendez," the technician said rapidly, his eyes fixed on my credential. "The system audit is complete. We have documented the absolute structural negligence of Melendez Corporate Holdings. Do we transmit the formal notice of security noncompliance directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the public stock floor now, ma'am?" Richard froze against the concrete, his breath catching in his throat as he waited for a speech. An explanation, or a final outburst of anger. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a single word. I didn't offer a lecture. I simply looked past him at the technician and gave a single, cold, downward nod of my head. A silent gesture that systematically sealed their financial fate. The Iron Curtain had officially dropped. I turned sharply on my heel. The clean, sharp report of my leather boots on the stone floor, completely erasing his final, desperate plea. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the deep, cream leather captain's chair, inside the cabin of the C-37B Gulfstream, as it climbed through the heavy cloud layer at 41,000 feet over the Atlantic coastline. The quiet hum of the military avionics was the only sound in the pressurized space. A flight steward had placed a crystal glass of neat bourbon on the mahogany side table without being asked. I opened my secure cellular terminal. The local news feeds were already flashing, with the aftermath of the Ritz-Carlton lockdown. The video of the FBI Cyber Division saluting a woman in a faded blazer had already reached 9 million views on the National Intelligence Watch networks. Melendez Corporate Holdings had been officially placed on the federal exclusion list. Pierce's venture capital partners had issued a public statement before 10 o'clock, completely severing their relationship with the firm, and pulling $42 million in liquidity assets to protect their own reputations. Richard's primary commercial project in Reston was officially dead in the water, the mechanics' liens multiplying like bacteria. Eleanor's country club membership had been suspended by 11:30, after a video of her wailing on the floor, in front of the state Senate delegation, was leaked to the local social registry page. The woman who had policed my access to her dining table was now being systematically scrubbed from the history of her own community. My phone vibrated with a single, restricted text message from Major General Miller. "Grid is stable. Sector isolated. Stand up straight, Colonel. The sky belongs to the people who hold the line." I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the heat burn away the last lingering taste of the dry turkey and the cold mud behind the tractor shed. I didn't type a response. I didn't check the financial statements of their bankruptcy filings. I locked the screen, tossed the phone onto the empty seat beside me, and pressed my forehead against the cool plexiglass window. Below us, the artificial lights of the American coast were fading into a vast, silent carpet of black ink. The dark blue Ford Escape was still parked behind the tractor shed in the mud, but the woman who had driven it there was gone. 3 days later, After completing the final manual overrides at the secure facility, the C-37B returned me to the quiet, snow-dusted foothills of Colorado Springs. I walked up the steps of my modest, two-bedroom brick bungalow. The air out here was clean, tin, and real. I unzipped my garment bag, pulled out my pristine Air Force service dress uniform, and fastened the silver eagles to my shoulders one last time, watching my reflection in the dim light. I didn't wear it for a crowd. I didn't wear it for a photo. I walked over to the small, unpretentious green fern sitting on the wooden table near the front window, the quiet plant that had survived the dry winter months in complete obscurity. Standing in my full dress uniform, the silver eagles catching the soft amber glow of my desk lamp, I calmly tipped a small pitcher of water into the soil. I reached up, caught the edge of the heavy canvas blinds, and pulled them closed with a single, firm motion, shutting out the screaming, frantic world of public performance forever. The harbor of my own choosing looked exactly the same, and I was completely at peace in the quiet shadow of my own authority. We live in a culture that confuses performance with power. We are taught to believe that the person who speaks the loudest, who commands the center of the room with custom clothes, gold passes, and a high net worth, is the person who controls the outcome of the coordinate space. We are trained to look at modesty as if it were a confession of lack, a sign of someone who has been beaten down by the velocity of life. But the truth is much quieter than that. True strength does not reside in custom tuxedos or corporate bank balances. It lives in the unyielding capacity to maintain your own internal stillness, when the rest of the world is frantically screaming to declare its existence. I spent 22 years constructing invisible walls of defensive infrastructure, to shelter millions of complete strangers from chaos. My deep physical modesty was never a confession of lack, but an impenetrable shield that guarded my presence from small minds, who cannot perceive light unless it is directly blinding them. When the floor began to vibrate beneath their feet under the red emergency lights, I didn't feel the small, hot satisfaction of a petty revenge. I simply witnessed the inevitable collapse of a structure that had been completely eaten away from the inside by its own arrogance. They called me an outdated desk clerk, because they never possessed the eyes or the structural depth to realize that my invisible foundation was the only thing keeping their fake kingdom from turning back into dust. If you are currently standing quietly on the margins of your own perimeter, silently protecting your baseline while the small people around you dismiss your worth, understand that you do not require their public confirmation to measure your dignity. Remain perfectly steady, lock your core, and keep commanding your own terminal, because the absolute sky will always belong to the people who know how to navigate the storm with the wings of objective truth. If this journey to reclaiming an unyielding boundary resonated with your own quiet endurance, please leave a like, subscribe for more true stories, and share how you broke your own generational curses in the comments. We survived the trenches of their contempt, so we can finally own the cold, quiet sky. Because, don't whine, that is your level, know your place, was never a statement about a cheap ticket by the kitchen toilets. It was the final, unwritten command a ghost gave to an empire of glass, before she pulled the plug and left them to freeze in the dark.